Hello, Hidden Gems. Thank you for your patience, going over notes, dealing with a travel studio, and looking forward, as are all of you, to being with my co host. Although we are miles apart tonight while I'm in Idaho covering the Kohberger sentencing, and you are at our house, Dr. John. You okay, John? You're looking up at something?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get my. I'm trying to get.
You
my
can look up. I just
screen.
wanted to make sure you're on the right camera. What are you looking at, babe? We had some tech difficulties, which was why we're a little late. So I wanted to make sure he was okay.
Okay, I'm good now.
Okay, you're good now. So we both watched the sentencing, and many were wondering, as was I, Dr. John Matthias's thoughts. For those new to our channel, we are hidden true crime. We delve into what is hidden, the hidden motives, the things hidden behind some of the darkest crimes. We have covered this case from the very beginning. We appeared in the first Dateline episode before we knew of Bryan Kohberger, when it was just a mystery, when you were profiling a possible person. And now here we are at the sentencing of Bryan Kohberger today. So surreal to be in that courtroom once again, this time to see justice served. And throughout this case, we have asked Dr. John Matthias, a clinical and forensic psychologist who has degrees from Princeton as well as the USC, and his thoughts. He has been assessing criminals for decades and is our co-host of Hidden True Crime. So it's really important, John, that you're here. Thank you. And we'd love to know your thoughts. What an overwhelmingly emotional day. That's for sure. And yeah, how are you? How were your thoughts watching it, babe?
I thought it was definitely one of the more interesting sentencing hearings I have seen in many years, maybe ever. So it was, because you had such a diversity of responses, and it was difficult. It was difficult to watch because it was so emotional. And it was, I thought there were a lot of very bold, strong, assertive statements or victim impact statements. And so, so the statements combined with Kohberger's reactions, I think were or lack of reaction. I'm sure most people noticed that, but I think that it was interesting to kind of just hear people's take on him, their perceptions of him and their anger at him, and to kind of evaluate their own grief, their own responses to this tragedy. So, I think this discussion is first of all, this is going to be a hard discussion. I think we're going to talk about some things, or I'm going to talk about some things that are going to be difficult. And for me, I don't know about for our listeners, but and I'm probably going to talk about some things that aren't going to be as obvious either. So, and just watching some of the post commentary, it's kind of what you'd expect. It was, these statements were amazing. They really expressed themselves well. And all that's true. There was so much emotion in the room. There were a lot of comments to that effect. But for those who know us, you'll probably know that part of my job is to step back a little bit and think about this at a maybe at a little bit of a different level, to kind of step back and reflect. And I think what was most interesting to me about this is I think this is really about how human beings respond to tragedy. This is really about tragedy. And I could argue that all of true crime is really about tragedy in a way. Everything we cover is about tragedy. I think this happens to be a particularly emotional instance tragedy, but not unlike obviously other cases we've covered, like Daybell. And so I think if when I think about tragedy, so I'm gonna people are gonna just stay with me here for a minute. When I think about tragedy, I actually go back and think about like human beings doing cave drawings tens of thousands of years ago. And I think one of the difficulties of tragedy is that tragedy is largely, our response to tragedy is largely an attempt to explain the inexplicable. Tragedy really pushes the limits of human understanding. We try to represent tragedy in a way that makes sense to us because we have no other choice. We deal with tragedy all the time. The Texas floods, tragedy, right? We try to explain it. We try to make sense of it. We try to make it rational. We try to make it fit a neat, tidy box, right? But no matter how we represent it, and when I say represent it, I mean, that's what when I talk about cave paintings tens of thousands of years ago, I'm talking about human beings' first attempts to represent the world in a way they could understand. And tragedy it's like those cave drawings times a million, right? Like we all want to understand tragedy, but in many ways, tragedy defies representation. So we have language, we have art, we have communication, relationships. Like there's different ways we try to communicate about tragedy to make sense of it. But I think in many ways we find that we find ourselves up against limits. We find that language is inadequate in some ways to explain tragedy. In fact, there was a moment in the sentencing when Ben Logan, who's Maddie's biological father, he kind of paused for a minute and he said, I just don't know what to say right now. I just don't know what to say right now. I just miss her so much. You could tell that Ben was very honest about, you could tell that Ben struggled a little bit, that he talked about his history with addictions and maybe he felt some guilt about his relationship with Maddie, but he couldn't find the words. And at some point, he just had to pause and say, I just don't know what to say. Words are failing me. And I think, to me, that was a really interesting moment because I think that's what tragedy does to us, human beings. It really forces us to figure out whether we have the words to make sense of it and whether we have the ability to make sense of it. We look at the limits of what we human beings are up against. And in spite of that, we don't have a choice. We experience this tragedy, but we have to respond somehow. That's why you get cave paintings, right? That's why you have movies and theater and books and social groups, right? It's all, much of this is an attempt to make sense of tragedy and to explain it. And so having said that, I think a big part of this, to me, one of the most interesting elements of today was not just how emotional people were, but how this very issue of how people respond to trauma and to pain, and how they experience grief, how people respond to tragedy, and the very different ways that human beings do that. And let me say, it's not, there's no one right way. We're all going to have different ways of responding to tragedy. And I think one of the interesting things about today was we saw that on display. We saw like a very wide range of responses to this horrible tragedy and the way that human beings cope with that, the way human beings try to express themselves and represent this type of tragedy. I think that's what was on display today. And what was interesting is that we saw a really interesting diverse, a number of diverse responses to this very tragic situation. And so I think they were all very moving, but in many ways they were also quite different. Some of them involved a lot of anger and almost retribution, and some of them involved more acceptance and more forgiveness. Some of them were quite personal, and some of them were attacking Kohberger. So, and again, none of those responses there's no right or wrong. There's tragedy, and then you go into the cave and you paint the pictures on the wall to try to make sense of it. So some of those pictures might be you attacking another tribe that's threatening you, and some of them might be fleeing the situation, right? They might be, recognizing that you don't want conflict and that you need to run away, right? So I think that what was fascinating to me about today was really, you have the same tragedy, right? You have the same horrible circumstance for everyone, and yet you get all these responses. And so I really thought that was interesting.
I agree. A wide range of responses today. It was overwhelming listening to each one of them. Tragedy. Yeah. You're right.
So let's talk about some of them. I don't want to get into detail too much about some of these responses, but the opening victim impact statement was by Bethany, and actually it was Bethany's friend ended up reading her statement. I guess she must have felt too overwhelmed, and when her friend read the statement, it was understandable about why she didn't read it, by the way. So Bethany talked about one thing thought that was interesting. Unlike the other statements today, Bethany talked about survivor's guilt. She talked about this idea of, she was in the home at the time, and she asked the question. She didn't name it as survivor's guilt, by the way, but that's what it was. So as someone who's worked with a lot of veterans, combat veterans, who have experienced this. So combat veterans I've had combat veterans, for example, who have been next to their fellow soldiers that stepped on landmines and they were blown up instantly. And the veteran I was working with survived without injury, and they saw their friends die. And there's just this tremendous guilt. And Bethany asked this question. She said, "Why me? Why did I live?" Right. And that's survivor's guilt. It's not uncommon. And so one of the things that stood out to me about Bethany's statement was that it was so personal in terms of her talking about locking the doors and staying at her parents' house all the time, 24/7, not going outside, isolating herself, not sleeping. She has insomnia. To me, I can't diagnose, obviously. I've never met Bethany, but she describes many symptoms of PTSD. She described depression. She couldn't get out of bed. I don't know if she has depression, but maybe some symptoms of depression, certainly not being able to get out of bed. She's afraid to go out in public. And yet she recognizes that in spite of this tragedy and all this negative impact, she recognizes that she needs to, the way she puts it is, she wants to live life to the fullest for her friends that died. So she again, you get this idea of tragedy kind of testing the limits of the human. Do we give up or do we not? When you have survivor's guilt, and by the way, I've had a lot of veterans over the years who have taken their lives because they couldn't live with the guilt. They felt like the guy who was next to his best friend who was blown up by a landmine, he felt like he should have protected him. He felt like he should have been there more for his friend, even though he knew logically that wasn't going to be possible. He felt like he should have been the one whose life ended and not his friend. And he fell into a very serious addictions. He contemplated taking his life many, many, many times. He attempted a few times, and that's how powerful it is. And so I think you have a lot of these symptoms of trauma, certainly, Bethany, and to kind of lead with that was very, very emotional for me. And the other thing that was interesting about Bethany's statement is, you have this kind of, she portrays Kohberger. I think that it's important to see it's not just the survivor's guilt that's impacting her, but this idea, this kind of this like Freddy Krueger character that exists in people's dreams, right? She has these nightmares. This character, the boogeyman character, that haunts you no matter what. You lock all the doors because you're afraid this person's going to come get you, right? This is kind of a figure in mythology that appears over and over again, like Chapakubra. It's that type of figure. Freddy Krueger, right? It's a mythological figure that represents darkness or evil. Evil was brought up a lot today, by the way. Almost every one of the statements every one of the people giving a statement today used the term evil. And so you have this shadowy, dark figure, right, lurking in the background. It's like the stuff of every one of our worst nightmares. And I think Bethany did an incredible job of portraying that. Not only the guilt she felt over losing her friends, surviving this tragedy, but kind of trying to hide from this dark figure that she can't escape, because ultimately this figure's in her imagination. I mean, yes, there is a serial killer that's named Bryan Kohberger that's out there. But as she points out, like, the impact of this goes way beyond what happened that day. It impacts everyone in that community who's locking their doors like Bethany and thinking that this guy's going to come for them, or this dark boogeyman type figure is going to find them next, right? So that's the kind of, I think that's kind of one of the consequences of something like this that a lot of people don't think about. But you really see it. You see it so powerfully with Bethany and her statement. The other thing that was interesting to me there was, because it was so emotional, I wanted to really zero in on Kohberger's body language and his reactions. And, of course, it was completely unemotional. There was no affect. And I think that's interesting because psychologists sometimes talk about something called emotional contagion. Emotional contagion, so emotional contagion, simply defined, is when you're with someone or you're with a group of people and they're experiencing certain emotions. It could be joy, could be positive emotions, could be negative, it could be sadness, could be anger. When you're with a group of people and you're picking up on the same social cues, a lot of times emotion will become contagious. It'll be transmitted from person to person. In fact, it often will occur in groups, like a courtroom. And so you could see that in the courtroom. You could feel that there was emotional contagion going on in that courtroom. So some of it is social cues, and some of it, by the way, is related to brain chemistry. So we have certain neurons called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons they had evolutionary value in the sense that they allowed us to have empathy with other people. They allowed us to kind of mimic other people's emotions so we could understand them and we could connect to them. And obviously connecting to other human beings, when you're human and you live in tribes, that's important for survival. So we have these mirror neurons, and we also are most of us, I think, are very adept at reading social cues. And that kind of combination of the brain and people's responses and social reactions to certain things, that creates emotional contagion. And the reason I bring that up is because the reason why that's important is because I wanted to see, so a normal human being in a room that's filled with emotion, that's teeming with emotion, a normal human being is going to feel that emotion and they're going to respond to it. And it was pretty clear that that's what was happening in that room. There's that picture of Dylan and her mother hugging.
Such a heartbreaking photo. The emotion in that photo is so profound to me. It's so sad.
It's an incredible photo. Like, I get emotional just looking at it, right? So that's emotional contagion. Look at the people around her. Look at the emotion between mother and daughter, but also look at the woman next to them. Look at the people. They're all in tears. That's emotional contagion. So when you have emotional contagion at this level, the obvious question to me is, okay, like, everybody in that room, including the judge, right? Everybody in that room is overwhelmed with emotion. So the obvious question is, from a criminal psychological standpoint, is the defendant experiencing any of that emotion? Because everybody in that room is feeling, right? So a normal human being, if I'm the defendant and I've committed these heinous crimes and I have a shred of empathy or remorse, I would be in tears.
Yeah. Yes.
And guess what? You know where this is going.
We know where this is
Guess
going.
what? Bryan Kohberger didn't shed a tear. He didn't express any sadness. He didn't express anything, right? And so when you look at a room where there's emotional contagion at this level, and you look at a guy like Kohberger with no emotion, now you know something's amiss, right? Now you can start. And again, I'm not going to diagnose here because I've never met Kohberger, so I'm not going to. You know, some of the victims, by the way, did diagnose, so I don't really have to. But it's interesting. I think one of the things I would say about Kohberger, and again, this isn't a diagnosis, this is an observation, is I think it seems reasonable to say that this is a guy who's in his head. This is a guy who's all cognitive. He's purely intellectual, or largely intellectual, that he uses intellectualization as a defense mechanism. There's no emotion, there's no affect, right? There's no connection to anything empathic or remorseful in that courtroom, even though the whole courtroom is in tears, even though emotion is just overspilling in this courtroom, it's overflowing. The reason why Kohberger can avoid that emotion is because he's so disconnected from his emotions and he's so overly intellectual. And you can get this, by the way, from some of the interviews with his friends and some previous people that we've talked to. But I think that's one possibility. You know, Alivea called him a psychopath. You know, I don't know if that's true. I'm not going to diagnose him, but it's certainly, psychopaths have no affect. They have no emotion. So is it possible that could explain his lack of emotion? Sure, that could be part of it. I know in some of the previous hearings there was a diagnosis of autism. I haven't seen that report, so I can't comment on it. It would depend on how severe it is, right? I mean, at the very least, he seems like he's fairly high functioning. So sometimes the lack of emotions can be associated with that. Sometimes it's not. It depends. But I point that out because you have this huge contrast between the emotion in the room and the emotion in the defendant. And that's, to me, that's always an interesting sign of what's going on.
A lot of people wanting to know your thoughts on his lack of emotion or any emotion he did show, or how stoic. I don't know what it is, but yeah, you're right. He was one thing is not like the others, and it was certainly him showing no emotion. Even his family, according to the witnesses, showed emotion.
And one thing that's important to note about emotional contagion, by the way, is that it's largely subconscious. It's largely thought to be a subconscious cognitive process. That there's something called cognitive appraisal theory, which explains how people respond to certain stimuli or how they respond to emotional contagion. And it's largely believed to be subconscious, which means that it would be difficult. It would be difficult to control. So what's really interesting about this is that if you think of emotional contagion as something you can't really control, I mean, I guess if you really tried hard, you could put the brakes on your emotions with that much emotion in a room, but it would be difficult. That when things are not conscious, when they're operating at a deeper level, a lot of times you're going to get a knee-jerk reaction, right? You're going to get an impulsive reaction to the emotion in the room, and you don't even get that here. I think that's what makes this really fascinating. Even at the deepest, subconscious levels, he's not responding to that emotion at any level. I mean, to me, that's amazing. I mean, it's possible he could have rehearsed. It's possible that he knew going into that sentencing hearing that it was going to be very emotional, and maybe he rehearsed, maybe he did some visualization. I don't know. There's ways he could have circumvented any emotional response. He could have detached completely. He could have dissociated. Those are possibilities. But all that's hard. All that takes a lot of work. I mean, he could have. But I think, again, like this idea that this is subconscious and he still isn't feeling suggests that this is something that runs deep. His lack of affect is something fundamental to this person, to Bryan Kohberger. Which, by the way, I could speculate probably has something to do with the murders, right? Like, if he has no affect and no emotions, and he's got this intellectual idea, let's say he wants to test out this theory that he can murder without consequence and he can get away with it, that he's, as people kept saying in the hearing today, that thinks he's the smartest one in the room. What if he thought all that? What if he thought he was going to test the hypothesis that he could get away with murder and it wouldn't bother him?
Yeah.
Then it becomes purely an intellectual exercise. And by the way, I'm going to throw this out because I mention it all the time with Kohberger, but he reminds me so much of the fictional character Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, who did precisely that, by the way. Raskolnikov murdered two people because he wanted to test the theory that he could get away with murder without feeling anything. And not only could he do it without feeling anything, but he could do it in such a way that he would never be caught. Right. And so the similarities are the similarities are incredible. I mean, Dostoevsky's book was written a long time ago. So I don't know if Kohberger has any familiarity with it, but he reminds me so much of that character.
He really does. Yeah. I agree with you. The what if, try not to get caught.
So those are some of my first thoughts. Let's move on let's talk a little bit about Dylan's victim impact statement.
Hearing from Dylan and Bethany, by the way, was a really profound moment for me. I've shared that in previous lives before you and I today, but we have heard very little from the roommates, understanding that they were in that house when it happened. And let's talk about Dylan.
So the other thing, by the way, before we move on to Dylan, I'm just thinking about Bethany and her comments about being vilified a little bit, being vilified and bullied on social media for not reporting the deaths of her roommates sooner, right? And the impact that had, that really took a huge toll on her. That was sad.
It really was.
That was sad too, just to see her just to see her vilified really for doing nothing wrong. And actually it was interesting because Dylan was in the same situation. Dylan encountered Kohberger in the hallway, and people were really upset with her, right, for not reporting it sooner. But she didn't mention it in her statement. So I thought that was interesting. She doesn't, I can't imagine the toll that must have taken on her.
I know it. I cannot imagine.
But to her credit, she didn't want to give that any oxygen, and she didn't talk about all the animosity directed towards her for not responding sooner. So I thought that was interesting. I thought what she left out was in some ways as interesting as what she talked about. One of the things I thought was interesting in Dylan's statement was how she portrayed what I would call the ripple effect of victimization, and that's exactly what it sounds like, which is that I think when you have a tragedy and you kind of drop the stone in the middle of the pond, and then you get the ripples moving out from the initial event, from the initial tragedy. I think she really portrayed that in a very moving way about how this has affected friends and family and community. And even, we're talking about it now, right? It's affected, in many ways, it's affected people all over the world. And so you can see kind of I think she did a really great job of kind of explaining that and talking about the ripple effect. The other metaphor I really liked that she used was being shattered. She brought that up a couple of times, that she felt like her world was shattered. She said, quote, "It shattered me." She explained she was 19 at the time. She had panic attacks that she couldn't control at all. She was afraid of the world. Her pain and her grief, as she said, was too much to handle. And this really got me. She said, "The only thing I could do was scream." When she said that, I instantly thought, again, I'm going to talk about art a little bit here. I thought of the famous painting by the artist Edvard Munch, The Scream, where you have the character that's kind of holding his face and the world is just kind of collapsing around him, right? It's, for those of you who know that painting, that's what, when she said the only thing I can do is scream, that's what I thought of. It's just like right, the world is just closing in on you and you're having panic attacks all the time. You feel shattered. You feel torn to pieces. You're afraid of the world. You're having pain. You've got grief that's overwhelming you. And she feels like apparently all she can do is scream. I thought that was just an incredible moment and very visual to me, because I thought of the Scream, the painting, and how that must have been like for her. One of the things, getting back to this idea of tragedy, one of the things I thought about with her and the way she described being shattered is this idea, I think, that tragedy oftentimes really undermines our basic assumptions about the world. And it really, whatever we thought the world was after tragedy, that changes. The world is no longer that safe and secure place that we thought. That in many ways, we lose some innocence. Like when we undergo a tragedy like this, she describes this. She's 19 years old. She feels shattered, right? All she can do is scream. That sense of safety and trust that a 19-year-old should have in college is gone. The world can never be the same for Dylan at that moment.
Yeah.
And for her, she explains that in terms of somatically, in terms of her bodily reaction. She explains it in terms of her emotional and psychological reaction. She describes some symptoms of trauma and PTSD. Towards the end, she says, although I had shattered parts, I'm still putting myself back together. So in other words, again, like with any tragedy, there's this idea of, do you give up or do you try to put the parts back together? And I mean, all of these people are, all of the victims giving statements today were obviously very strong and committed to the idea of putting the pieces back together in their own way. And that, I think we have a clip that I want to play towards the end. So then she said something at the very end that I thought was really profound. Do we have that clip?
Yeah, we do right here.
Okay.
A year ago, I had a
One second.
Yeah, I can't hear it.
about a year ago, I had a dream about them. I got to say goodbye. I told them I won't be able to see you again, so I need to tell you goodbye. They all kept asking why, and all I could say was, I can't tell you, but I have to. When I woke up, I felt shattered and heartbroken, but also strangely grateful. Like maybe in some way that dream gave us the goodbye we never got. Still, no dream can replace them, and no goodbye will ever feel finished. He is a hollow vessel, something less than human. A body without empathy, without remorse. He chose destruction. He chose evil. He feels nothing. He tried to take everything from me. My friends, my safety, my identity, my future. He took their lives, but I will continue trying to be like them to make them proud. Living is how I honor them. Speaking today is to help me find some sort of justice for them. And I will never let him take that from me. He may have taken so much from me, but he will never get to take my voice. He will never take the memories I had with them. He will never erase the love we shared, the laughs we had, or the way they made me feel seen and whole. Those things are mine. They are sacred, and he will never touch them. I get to feel sadness. I get to feel rage. I get to feel joy even when it's hard. I get to feel love even when it hurts. I get to live. And while I will still live with this pain, at least I get to live my life. He will stay here, empty, forgotten, and powerless.
Yeah. Wow. That's one of the most profound, powerful victim impact statements I've ever heard, how it's affected me. I don't want to it's just so sad.
Yeah, that was one of the most moving moments for me today. Couple of thoughts on that. The dream part is, so one of the difficulties of tragedy and tragic events is trying to find some sense of closure, right? Trying to find some sense of resolution. And I think the difficulty or the challenge of tragedy is oftentimes you're seeking resolution for something that has no resolution. In the sense that when we lose people closest to us, friends and family, we can't bring them back. There's no resolution. There's only grief, right? And so the dream, as she says in the dream part, she's trying to say goodbye. She's trying to seek some type of resolution or closure. But she recognizes it's a lifelong process. Like there's no such thing as absolute closure. And so I think you see that here. She's really struggling with this, trying to saying goodbye, seeking some closure, some resolution, and yet knowing that that's going to be really hard to do. And the other part of that, I think, that was really moving to me was that she says, he will never take my voice. He will never take my memories. He will never take the love that we shared. And I think that sentiment is so important for going on,
Yes.
for grieving, recognizing that whatever else someone takes from you, you have your memories, you have your love with those people, right? You have your voice. And in fact, of course, she's expressing her voice. She's doing the very thing that she says is important to do. She's giving voice to the unnameable. She's giving voice to the unbearable. She's giving voice to the thing that makes tragedy the most difficult is when we can't give voice to something. And she's doing it. And so I think that was really profound, is that even though I don't think she would say that, that's my interpretation. But when we come up against the limits of human understanding and human representation, we need to figure out a way to go on. And that's what she's doing. She's giving voice. She's trying to represent this experience in a way that allows her to grieve and to go on. And I think she does it beautifully.
Well said, John. I agree. She did it beautifully. It was heartbreaking. I wish her the best of luck moving forward. And I know she'll make her roommates proud.
I think I have a visitor. So, hey, bud, could you give me a little bit? I'll be with you in a minute, okay?
Was he just dropped off?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. I'd invite him into my office, but I don't want him to necessarily hear what we're talking about here. So,
he understands,
hopefully-
right? He's good. Yeah.
yeah.
Intermission.
Intermission.
Yeah.
Intermission. Yeah, intermission, because we're going to change gears a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about the Goncalves family reactions to Kohberger.
Yeah.
I think that the interesting thing, so again, I just want to preface this by saying that we all have very different responses to grief and pain and suffering and tragedy. And I think it's interesting to me that after some of the initial impact statements, we started seeing more anger, right? We started this theme of anger and maybe even retribution started playing out a little more. And that, by the way, of course, is a very normal response to tragedy. The little guy who just poked his head in my door, if somebody took him from me, I can't, my fury and my anger would be unquenchable. I don't know what I would do. So I understand the Goncalves' response is a very normal response. I think that there was a lot of anger. There was this almost, there was this desire to really confront him and to really, to tell him obviously what to kind of give him their version of the unvarnished truth. And that, I thought that was interesting because you don't see that. I haven't seen that a lot in victim impact statements. I mean, I've seen it some, but I think this is a family that still has a lot of residual anger, and I think they're really struggling, to make sense of what happened, understandably. every tragedy is senseless. And it really, as I said earlier, it's inexplicable. And it really kind of forces our hand to figure out how we can make sense of it and how we can explain it. And even though we never fully can, we try. So I think this is kind of this is a normal response to grief. It's a bit of a different response. Steve, who's Kaylee's father, said, quote, "Nobody cares about you. We will forget you. You picked the wrong family." Right? He's letting him know that he's kind of letting him know that this is a family that was proactive. This is a family that was going to find out the truth. They were going to find out who committed these murders. And, that was a theme here of this family in terms of just letting him know that he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. Alivea, who spoke after Steve, that's Kaylee's sister. She says, "I'm angry." She tells us she's angry. She says, "I'm angry. I'm shouting inside my own head at everything I could say to you." Oh, but she wasn't done. She goes on. She says, do we have the clip from Alivea?
We do have
Here
it.
and
Yep,
give you what
we'll
you
pull it
want.
up. Here we go.
I won't offer you tears. I won't offer you trembling. Disappointments like you thrive on pain, on fear, and on the illusion of power. And I won't feed your beast. Instead, I will call you what you are: sociopath, psychopath, murderer. I will ask the questions that reverberate violently in my own head, so loudly that I can't think straight most any day. Some of these might be familiar, so sit up straight when I talk to you. How was your life right before you murdered my sisters? Did you prepare for the crime before leaving your apartment? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling at this time. Why did you choose my sisters? Before making your move, did you approach my sisters? Detail what you were thinking and feeling. Before leaving their home, is there anything else you did? How does it feel to know the only thing you failed more miserably at than being a murderer is trying to be a rapper? Did you recently start shaving or manually pulling out your eyebrows? Why November 13th? Did you truly think your Amazon purchase was untraceable because you used a gift card? How do you find it enjoyable to stargaze with such a severe case of visual snow? Where is the murder weapon? The clothes you wore that night? What did you bring into the house with you? What was the second weapon you used on Kaylee? What were Kaylee's last words?
She doesn't stop there, by the way. So some of the things she continued to say was that she said, quote, "You thought you figured out the human psyche. You thought you were smarter than anyone else. You're a wannabe. You're not profound. You're pathetic. No one is impressed by you. You're pitifully average. Don't convince yourself that you matter."
Wow.
So, obviously, this is someone who's very angry, and rightfully so, by the way.
Rightfully so.
And so this style of victim impact statement, which is very confrontational, is a little unusual. I mean, it's something I haven't seen too much over the years, and so I applaud her for being so assertive and so honest. as someone who's worked with people like Kohberger, I do have concerns that this is the type of thing they thrive on.
Yeah.
This is the type of thing that like Kohberger's going to really remember, and he's going to be, this is sort of like throwing red meat, you know, to a caged lion, right? Like he's the type of guy I think that that would really feed off of this. I you know, so the question for me looking at something like this, the question is, you know, did I hope that it benefited Alivea. I hope she felt like this helped her, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. I just kind of have concerns that this type of response to somebody like Kohberger is precisely what he wants. And unfortunately, by the way, like I think, you know, when you tell someone that they don't matter and they're pathetic and they're average, I mean, the problem with that to me, and I'm not detracting from the statement, the problem with that, I think, is that, you know, obviously there's a mixed message there, right? The message is that he's obviously not average enough, or he matters enough that the whole world is talking about him, right? Like she's kind of saying to him, you know, you're pathetic, you're a wannabe, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, like everybody's watching this, like the whole world's paying attention. He's mattering now. He's mattered more tonight than he ever has. And I know people are saying, let's not give any oxygen. Let's forget about him. Let's ignore him, right? That was a theme from today, but that's easier said than done. There's in psychology, there's something called psychological reactance, which is that when people perceive a threat to their freedom, they actually do the opposite. So this is kind of the idea. So there's been research, for example, showing that when you put up do not touch signs, people want to touch it. there's been some research, like when you say don't touch this, people touch it way more than they would otherwise. And that's psychological reactance. When you tell people not to do something, or you threaten them with taking away something from them, they're typically going to respond the opposite, or not always, but they may respond the opposite way, right? And so like, so I see the value of this type of statement to the victim and to the victim's well-being, but I wonder about how it's going to land with Kohberger, for example, whether he's going to be affected by that. And I kind of wonder about the message there, you know, that if you say that someone is really average, well, clearly he's not average because he's got your attention and he's got the whole world's attention, right? Clearly you say he doesn't matter, but obviously he matters because he's got our attention. We're talking about him right now. We're talking about victims, but we're talking about victims because of him. And so I don't know, you know, I think time will tell how something like this plays out, right? I mean, I hope for her, I hope it allows her to heal, and I hope it allows her to move past it. But I'm not sure that this is going to affect people's capacity or interest in Bryan Kohberger. In fact, I think I would worry that this type of reaction to Kohberger actually kind of consolidates and amplifies the myth that is Bryan Kohberger. The myth that, you know, in some ways, like if you tell people he doesn't matter, people become more interested in him. People want to know more about him. So people that today, you know, that watch this, that knew nothing about Kohberger, they're probably Googling Kohberger tonight and trying to figure out more about Bryan Kohberger. So it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of, you know, if you say you don't want someone to get attention or you want to move on from them, and then you're kind of promoting them, I worry about where that goes.
We have a question here, and it's actually my question too. Before we get into this question, though, I do want to say I empathize with Olivia, whose grief is anger. I've had a lot of grief this last year. I didn't have a family member that was murdered. I'm not comparing my grief to hers at all. I'm just talking about some personal grief that I have dealt with because of a loss of a sibling. And I've talked a lot about it with John because I never knew that grief could be so angry. And I've felt a lot of anger this past year. I've had to talk to John about it. So I do understand when she stood up and she said, I am so angry. Grief is often anger, and I've learned that a lot this year. But Felicia is saying this, and I have a question for you, John. Felicia is saying, Dr. John, I am confused.
Mm-hmm.
Olivia said what everyone says the killer thrives on. So to deny him, in other words, to deny him the sorrow, deny the killer tears, the grief of the victim's loved ones. She's saying, isn't it true that the killer thrives on tears, grief, and we denied him that? No?
No, I disagree.
Hmm.
I disagree. He's not thriving on grief and tears. He's thriving on attention. He might thrive on that, but he's also thriving on anger. He's loving it. Like he thrives on conflict. He thrives on anger. There's no easy answer here in terms of how to give a victim statement. You give a victim statement in the way that you think is the most healing for you. Whatever that is. If it's anger, acceptance, forgiveness, retribution, whatever, like that's what you should do, right? But like what somebody like Kohberger thrives on is, I think, is attention. And by confronting him in that manner, you're probably giving him more attention. And again, I don't know what the right victim impact statement is. I don't know what I would have said. I'm sure I would have been angry as hell. I could relate to Steve. He was angry as hell. I'm sure I would be. I don't know if the bailiffs would have to intervene if I'm giving a victim impact statement, because I would be so angry. But on the other hand, like I know a guy like Kohberger is going to feed off of this type of emotion. He's going to feed off of all these emotions, but I think more so the ones that are critical of him, more so the ones that, because at some level, for a guy like Kohberger, at some level, in his mind eye, he doesn't think that's accurate. You can say he's not smart, but he thinks he is. Like he's always going to think he is. You're not, like, in many ways, for him, you're just being more provocative. You can say he's pathetic. You can say he's average. He knows he's not, or he thinks he's not. I mean, he got caught. That's true. But he was a really good student, and he was praised up and endlessly by his professors. He was getting his PhD. I mean, he had really poor social skills, but like he was always the top of his class. He was always getting the best grades. Like getting caught, I mean, in his mind's eye, getting caught doesn't mean he's average. It just means he pulled off something that most people couldn't pull off. And he's going to think, hey, I pulled this off. I was always the best student, right? He's not going to think of himself as average just because, somebody tells him he's average, or somebody's critical of him, or somebody belittles him. I don't think it's going to change his perception of himself. In fact, I think it's just going to make him angrier, and it's going to feed his narcissism. Right? And so if the goal here was to shame Kohberger, and if the goal here was to somehow put Kohberger in his place, I mean, This family doesn't have to worry about that because he's going to do multiple life sentences. So the judge took care of that for them. But if the goal is to somehow, I don't know, belittle him and put him in his place, I'm not sure that's going to work for a guy like Kohberger. I think it may work for this family in terms of how they want to feel and help them to express their anger in a way that's healthy. But I don't, if the end game is to like end this and make him feel ashamed and less than average, I'm not sure it's accomplishing that. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think Kohberger is actually emboldened by these types of statements, and he's going to go back to his cell tonight because he's still in jail. He's going to go back to his cell and he's going to think, wow, I did great. I really inflamed these people. Like, man, I'm something special. But I don't know. I could be wrong. I mean, I don't know Kohberger. I haven't talked to him, obviously. So, but I know people like Kohberger, and I know after hearing these types of things, they're actually quite empowered by it. So I don't know.
Right. And as C. West says, Olivia's words were cathartic for her and for a whole lot of people that watched it. Mm-hmm. And that's what is important, not that fool. We agree.
Yeah.
We concur.
Right. Exactly. I think for her, for Olivia and Steve and the family, it matters a lot. And for the community, for the people listening, it matters a lot. But in terms of like, I think there's a paradoxical effect here, which is that if we want to, the judge said this towards the end, and the prosecutor said this, basically, let's forget about Kohberger and move on, right? You're asking us to forget about something. I think if that's the goal, unfortunately, I think these types of statements, although they can be cathartic to the victim and to the audience in the short term and the long run, these types of things, I think, tend to only enhance the mythology of a serial killer like Kohberger. They kind of feed the mythology of this guy. They feed interest. Potentially.
Yeah. Thank you, Olivia, though, for expressing your anger, your grief, and what so many are feeling. I believe she nailed Kohberger, that's for sure. I see you looking at your notes.
Yeah, let me move on. Let me move on to Jeff, Xana's dad.
Okay.
He says, he didn't give a very long statement, but he said something. He talked about memories just as some of the other Dylan talked about that obviously a little bit, but he says, quote, memories are what really count. That's what I can go on with. Right. And I mean, and again, that's another way of dealing with grief. That you kind of accept that the person is gone and they're not coming back, but you also know that you have these memories. So memories are what preserve history. Memories are right. They're the way we remember someone and their story and their impact on us. And in many ways, that's really all we can cling to when someone passes away. I mean, we have pictures but all of that's just a function of memories. And I think, I think Jeff really gets that. And Jeff, I thought that I really appreciated Jeff's insight into that he's reminding us that he's got these positive memories And that's enough for him to go on with. And so that's how he's dealing with grief. Another type of statement was Xana's aunt. This was after Jeff spoke. And she said, quote, "I'm always looking for the positive thing because evil and hate can destroy people." She said she started off being really angry, but she realized that was being destructive. So I really appreciated her kind of desire to kind of find some of the positive. Do we have the clip from her?
I believe we do, yeah.
Okay. Can we play that?
Which part did you want to play, John? I have a couple.
This is the part about the tragedy has brought us closer.
Yep, pulling it
Xana's
up.
aunt.
Yeah, Xana's aunt.
But how I look at it now is this tragedy, this horrible tragedy on all of the 4 children, has brought us closer. You united us with your actions. We're united now, and we're stronger than ever. We have family and friends now that we never knew we had. And, this is probably going to bother everybody, but Bryan, I'm here today to tell you I have forgiven you because I no longer could live with that hate in my heart. And for me to become a better person, I have forgiven you. And anytime you want to talk and tell me what happened, get my number. I'm here, no judgment, because I do have answers or questions that I want you to answer. And I'm here. I'll be that one that'll listen to you. Okay? Thank you, Your Honor.
Wow.
Right?
It actually
Wow.
reminded me, I want to say this too. There was another victim impact statement that I heard in court that sounded very similar to this. And that was Libby's mother in Delphi, Indiana. Libby's mother said the same thing. If you're ever willing to talk, let me know. I'll listen. That was, yeah.
And so, I said at the beginning that this is about a tragedy, and it's about how we make sense of tragedy and how we respond to it. And so here again, I presented different versions of victim impact statements and what they're trying to convey. And here again is a very different response, right? This is someone who she's trying to be as positive as she can. And she says she's forgiven him. I've forgiven you because I could no longer live with that hate in my heart. And she's even willing to listen to him, right? I mean, and again, like, none of these are better than the others. And I don't know, like, I don't think I could do what she did. I don't think I could be this forgiving of someone like Kohberger if he took my child's life. So this is a pretty remarkable moment for me because she genuinely seems to have forgiven him and to have accepted it. That doesn't mean she's moved on. I'm sure she's still grieving every day, but
She certainly has, and as she says, she has so many questions for him. Yeah.
But she wants to listen. She wants, as she said, she wants to sit down and listen to what his version of events are, and to make sense of it in that way. And the only way she can do that is because she's forgiven him, right? She can't sit next to him in a room if she's so enraged that she feels like tearing his heart out, which I probably would feel. But I mean, again, one of the interesting things about today was just this diversity of responses. Bethany, right? Talking about survivor's guilt. And here you get Kim talking about forgiveness and acceptance. And then we have the Goncalves family talking about their anger and just being so enraged at Kohberger. You don't see this gamut of responses that often in these types of cases. And so I thought that was really interesting and
I agree.
touching, by the way. It was
Yes.
quite moving for her to get to the point where she can forgive him or can forgive him at that level. I think was very moving to me, because I don't know if I could do that. I'd probably want to piggyback on Olivia's response, by the way, or some version of her response. Randy, just quickly, Randy is Xana's stepdad. He gave a fairly short speech. One of the things I like that Randy said is that he just wants to get through it. He just wants to get through it, right? And I think a lot of people, when tragedy strikes, that's how they feel. Like they're overwhelmed. Their emotional and psychological and even physical well-being is just overwhelmed. And just functioning is very difficult. And one of the big questions in any tragedy is how do we cope? How do human beings cope with the unimaginable? How do we cope with the unbearable? One of my favorite plays of all time is Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which is, although it's a comedy, it's also kind of a tragedy. And it's about these two tramps that it's hard to describe for people that don't know this play. These two tramps that just kind of, they bully each other, they love each other. Like it's a really peculiar play, but there's a really famous line in that play, and Randy reminded me of it. There's a really famous line in that play where one of the tramps says, "I can't go on." And then he pauses for a moment and he says, "I'll go on." Right? And that's this idea of life can be really hard at times. It can be really painful. It can throw some real tragedies at us. But in some ways, we just have to find a way to go on for people we love, for ourselves. Right. And that's kind of what Randy said. And it was a moment that reminded me very much of Godot. And then here's another response. Karen, who's Xana's mother, Karen made an appeal to Jesus, and she referred to Jesus as her Lord and Savior. And she said that she forgave Kohberger because of Christ. And she hopes that he reads the Bible to comprehend what happened. And she reads the Bible to comprehend and make sense of it. And so, again, this is a different response, right? Christianity offers a very compelling narrative about how to deal with suffering and how to cope with suffering. And Karen exemplifies that. And Karen was quite vocal about that today. So again, we're seeing you have this very large gamut of responses to tragedy and to responding to tragedy and to coping with tragedy. And so Xana's mother was another example of a very different response. And then I think last but not least, I would say that Ethan's family provided an even different response, which was that they didn't speak. They felt like they didn't need to express their grief publicly. They wanted
Right.
to remain private, right? And so again, that's quite different than saying that you forgive someone or expressing your rage towards someone, right? Like, or saying that you're dealing with your suffering through Jesus or through Christianity, right? Again, like I've never seen this so much diversity in terms of how victims are responding to one particular tragedy. So I thought that was, and again, so Ethan's family, for whatever reasons, just presumably some of it has to do with them wanting to stay private, and they want to deal with their grief privately and in their own personal way, and so they don't want to make a public statement, right? That says volumes too.
Yes.
That suggests to me that they're still coming to terms with it, or maybe they have come to terms with it. Maybe there's a certain level of self-acceptance there. I'm not sure, but I think we can't leave Ethan's family out of this, because them not making a public statement also is a response to grief that should not be neglected. And I want to mention Ethan because he too is obviously a victim, and he deserves to be mentioned. And so my heart goes out to Ethan's family. Thank you for whatever reasons you didn't respond or want to show up and make a public statement. I understand. And in many ways, by not doing that, you're sending a message about how you're grieving with this. And thank you thank you to them for doing what they're most comfortable with.
Yeah. Thank you, Gossip, Rumor, and Innuendo, who, by the way, I love your channel. And she wrote, I love that we can all process our grief here together. Thank you, Lauren and Dr. John. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. And again, I wish I could say that there was a uniform response to grief, but there's not. And to me, that was probably the most fascinating thing about the sentencing hearing today, was just the way that a number of different victims and human beings and were coping with this tragedy and responding to it, and how they felt that their public statements would impact not only themselves but the people in that room, and even Kohberger.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything else? I know the judge spoke, prosecutor spoke.
Yeah, the prosecutor spoke. It was interesting. I thought the prosecutor and the judge gave some very, very touching statements. But I don't know how to. I'm trying to figure out a way to talk about this without kind of stirring the pot here.
You pot stir, you. Do you want to save that for Patreon?
Do you have any of the clips from the prosecutor or the judge?
Let's see if I pulled those. I do have both. What?
I don't remember. What's the clip you have? Why don't you play the clip from the prosecutor, please?
Okay, prosecutor.
I have one last thought. After Your Honor imposes judgment and sentences the defendant to spend the rest of his life in prison, in other words, sentence the defendant to die in prison, he's going to stand up in the belly chains and leg irons that he's wearing today, and he's going to be escorted into the custody of the Idaho Department of Correction. And the door will close behind him forever. That is the closure that we seek, that all of these people, these loving friends and family deserve, so that we can move forward.
So I get that statement, and you know, I was quite touched by the fact that he was so emotional. You know, the prosecutor was in tears for a bit, and that again, that too is highly unusual. Usually, prosecutors and DAs try to keep their emotions in check. In fact, I can't remember a prosecutor in tears that I've seen in a long time. You know, so I appreciate what he said. The statement, though, about the door will close behind him forever, and that is the closure that we seek, and that all of these people deserve, so that we can move forward. I think I was slightly put off by that statement, in the sense that if we think about grief, everything we've talked about in the show today has been about different responses to grief, right? And different reactions to tragedy, and different ways of grieving tragedy. It felt to me like he was a little too eager to this idea of shutting the door and seeking closure. It just felt like he was a little too eager to shut the door on all of this, and somehow, you know, he's gonna be put in shackles, and they're gonna shut the door, and then we can all move on. I mean, I think to some degree that's true, but grief is a very personal, individual, idiosyncratic process. And I feel like, you know, how I grieve and how the families grieve and how you grieve and how our audience grieves, they're all going to be different. And I don't know that it's as simple as just shutting a door and getting closure and moving forward. I mean, of course, we all want to move forward. And of course, we all want closure. But, you know, I don't know if there's such thing in a case like this, or even like, let's think about the Texas floods. I don't know that there's ever total closure in these situations. And I don't know if somebody can dictate what that closure should look like, and how it should happen, and when it should happen. And that somehow, if Kohberger's put in shackles and the door's shut, that somehow we're all going to find closure. I don't think it's that simple. If there's any point I'm trying to make tonight, is the tragedy is incredibly complex. We're testing the limits of human understanding and the limits of human comprehension. We're trying to explain the inexplicable, right? Like, that's what tragedy does. I don't know that closure is that simple. So while I appreciate what the prosecutor said, I just felt like, to me, and again, I'm speaking personally here, I felt like, in a way, I felt like he was trying to push me towards that, or push people towards that. That should be up to us to decide. It should be up to the audience to decide. And it would be very hard for someone to kind of dictate the terms of that closure. That's not how grief works. That's not how tragedy works. So I think I appreciate his sentiment. I appreciate the emotions. He was obviously very emotional. It was a very heartfelt statement. But it wasn't, you know, I'm giving him a lot of leeway here, but it wasn't something I felt like that was necessarily his prerogative to determine.
And what about the judge? I want to say something about Judge Hippler. I really like Judge Hippler. You know, I feel like people have been really hard on him. I've always liked Judge Hippler. He follows the rule of law. I do see him having compassion. I have seen him fight for the roommates. I've seen him fight for victims. I've seen him to keep order in his courtroom. It seems like he has a lot of compassion and empathy. I think that some people saw a little bit more of that today, but I applaud Judge Hippler, not just like today, but like this case since it has come to Ada County. I think he's done an excellent job keeping order in his courtroom and the rule of law, while also showing empathy and compassion. But let's talk about his final statements, because you felt some mixed feelings about those too.
I think so. Okay. Again, let me just say this. I was quite moved by Judge Hippler's final statement, and he was getting emotional, which is very unusual for a judge. He was very, very emotional when he gave that statement, and that was highly unusual. I appreciated a lot of what he said. I think there was a little moment in there where I felt like the prosecutor, I think he was kind of pushing for closure. Let's call it premature closure. I don't know what else to put. Like, for me, you and I, we get emotionally invested in a lot of our cases. And there are cases where I think you and I can, I'll speak for myself, where I can find some degree of closure after you and I kind of get invested. There are some cases where it's much harder to find closure. There are some cases we cover that I don't think I'll ever find any emotional closure.
Right.
And I'm not family, right? I'm not like you and I are covering stuff. I'm not a direct victim. So I can't even imagine what it would be like for family to find closure if such a thing is possible. But there was a little bit of this theme of, the judge said at one point something like, it's time for his 15 minutes of fame to end, or something like that. And again, I don't, it kind of felt like the prosecutor, I get the need for closure and the need to move on, and everybody wants to do that in every criminal case. But I just don't know if someone can tell us that. I don't know if someone in a position of authority can tell us to when we should find closure, or how we should grieve, right? And so I understand the sentiment, but I don't know if I totally agree with that message. The other thing that kind of bothered me a little bit is the judge did talk about, he mentioned that Kohberger was evil. He talked about unspeakable acts of evil. He said he used the word slithered. He slithered through the door. So he kind of compared Kohberger to a snake. And I mean, okay, I get that the judge is upset, and I get that, I agree with him. These were heinous acts. But I don't, I don't know. I would never, in one of my evaluations, use the term slithered. In a professional capacity, I would never say that someone committed an act of evil. And that's not to say a judge can't do that or shouldn't do it. So I don't know the right answer here, but I think, like, again, if we get back to this idea of tragedy and how human beings interpret tragedy and how we try to explain tragedy and make sense of tragedy, I think in some ways it's easier. It's easier for us as human beings to try to label something as evil, or label something reductively, or say that someone's like a snake and slithered through the door, so that it simplifies what happened. It makes it easier for us to understand. And I think, by the way, the motif of evil coming up again and again in this sentencing hearing by the victims, I think almost every one of them called him evil. And they have every right to do that, right? But if we're stepping back a little bit and thinking about this in broad terms, it's a way to simplify this. It's a way to take a tragedy that's really difficult to understand and complex, and, as I said, kind of test the limits of human understanding and make it understandable. Make the easiest, the way, if you want to reduce tragedy to its most simplistic level, just call somebody evil, wrap it up, put it in a package, wrap it up in a neat little bow, and now we're done. Now we can move on. Now we've got closure. He's evil. Let's move on. Don't worry about this. We've just solved this, right? And I think my point has been today in this show that resolution and closure are very, very difficult when it comes to tragedy, if not impossible. And so I don't know if things are that simple or they work that easily. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't move on. I'm not saying that we shouldn't seek closure. I'm just saying, like, the judge and the prosecutor are resorting kind of these overly simplistic, reductive strategies to put a little, nice little bow on this package and call it evil and make it simple so that we can just walk away tonight and feel good about ourselves and not worry about that this would ever happen to us or our children or our families or our communities, and somehow we can find closure. And I just don't think it's that simple.
We had a little bit from the judge. Did you want us to play that? Or
Sure.
do we? Okay.
In the end, the more we struggle to seek explanation for the unexplainable, the more we try to extract a reason, the more power and control we give to him. In my view, the time has now come to end Mr. Kohberger's 15 minutes of fame. It's time that he be consigned to the ignominy and isolation of perpetual incarceration.
That was an interesting thing. Happy Robot says Dr. John doesn't want to be reductive. He said the more that we try to understand why.
I'm laughing because I feel like I feel like there's a little bit of humor in that, because that's I've been going over and over that tonight. But yeah, I mean, I hope one of my takeaways tonight is that grief is very complex and tragedy is complex, and people have different reactions to it, and they're all fine.
But I want to talk about what the judge just said.
Yeah.
That the more we focus on an explanation, the more we feed into Bryan Kohberger, and we are called hidden true crimes. This was a confusing moment for me.
No, I know.
To hear the judge say, we delve into, the why. We always say we're a why done it channel, not a who done it. We're a why. We want to understand. And we get pushback a lot. And we got pushback from one of my favorite judges today, Judge Hippler. I love Judge Hippler, who said to us all that if we focus on an explanation to try to understand, we're feeding into this criminal. And it is 15 minutes of fame. And that was a moment for me. I wanted to talk to you about it. I want to talk about this because, again, Judge Hippler is no bigger fan than me.
Yeah.
And that was hard for me. I don't know.
Well,
I took it personally because this is what I do. This is what I do with you. We try to understand the why. We try to explain. We try to delve into the explanations that are really difficult sometimes. And I feel passionate about our work and what you and I do. And I don't know if I agreed with him in that moment either.
Well, you can disagree with someone and still respect them.
I do respect him.
Right. You can disagree with someone and still agree with a lot of what they say. So I think, again, not being overly reductive, it's fine. I'm sure people are disagreeing with some of my analysis tonight. I said this is going to be a hard discussion.
And it's okay to disagree with John. A lot of people, will disagree with you and us on the,
Yeah, please disagree with me. I'm offering a perspective. I'm not exactly this is a hard discussion because I think there were certain victim impact statements that touched me more than other ones. And that probably resonated with me more than other ones. And that's just a personal thing. But I think people might look at this show tonight and go, well, why didn't he say more about this statement or that? Why didn't he find this statement to be more effective? Right? I don't know. But you can disagree. You can disagree with the judge and still respect him and still agree with a lot of what he says. That's fine. That's being human. We don't need complete agreement. I don't want complete agreement. So let's talk about Let's talk about what we just said, that by trying to seek an explanation, we're only empowering him or empowering criminals, right? I absolutely disagree with that. Not only in terms of you and I trying to explain the criminal psyche, but also in terms of the whole theme of what we're talking about in this show tonight, which is that in many ways, tragedies defy understanding. But no matter what, we're still going to try to understand. There's nothing wrong. It's only human beings need and want to understand. And even if we can't fully understand something, we still want to try to represent that. We still want to, that's why we have art. That's why we have all different types of art, right? We have visual art, we have podcasts, we have audio art, we have books, we have literature. We have different disciplines like sociology, like physics. All of those are different ways to try to understand and interpret the world. That's what human beings do, especially in the face of the inexplicable and the senseless and things that challenge our capacity to understand. Now, having said that, I don't want to oversimplify. Right? The goal for, I think, so I disagree with them. I think that as human beings, we're always going to keep trying to explain. We're always going to keep trying to explain. And we're going to do it over and over and over because so many tragedies that occur in our lives are not explicable. But in order for us to go on and to cope and to grieve and make sense of it, we have to explain or try to explain as best we can. And I think that's the purpose of our channel. So if I don't disagree with them, I think we're out of business. Right? Your mic is off.
One more question. I want everyone to know, by the way, that the James Craig script that we've been working on is nearing. As soon as I'm off, I'm gonna finish, I'm gonna go over some of it, and then we will be doing a live James Craig trial update. After this, I might, change my shirt and brush my hair. But here's a question. By Miss T. I've been pinning a lot of your questions, by the way, but Miss T, I want to ask part of Misty's question because I ask you this a lot. You ask criminals this. So Dr. John is the one that stands in front of criminals privately or sits in front of them privately with them with a pen and a paper and says, why did you do this? Which is what everybody's wanting to know, which is what Judge Hippler said. Let's stop asking why. But all of us here at Hidden True Crime want to understand why. And you're the one that sits in front of these criminals and says why. And you tell me a lot about what they say. So Miss T is asking, why does Dr. John think BK didn't tell us what happened today? He respectfully declined to do any sort of a statement. Why do you think he didn't tell us what happened? So many people want to know. We want to know the why. I know what you've told me the criminals say to you when you ask them why. But why didn't he tell us today? And why do you think? That's really loaded. We can save the why for maybe another season. But why didn't he tell us today?
Well, that's a really complex question we could spend 3 hours on. But
Right. Forgive me.
most criminals don't know why.
Yeah.
So the short answer to the question is, I will do a 6-hour evaluation. I'll sit in a prison or a jail cell all day for 6-7 hours, and at the end of that, I always ask one question: tell me why you think you did this. Tell me why you think you committed this crime. And 98% of the time, they will say, I have no idea. The reason I do that is because I want to see the level of self-awareness and self-insight they have. However, even when they do give me answers, and I've gotten some really good ones, by the way, that I think show some degree of insight. Even the answers they give me are still a small part of the story. So if I get back to Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, one of Dostoevsky's points, or one of his motifs, I think, in that book, is that there's really no simple explanation. There's never going to ever be a simple why. There's always going to be multiple factors involved in explaining the why. And for example, Kohberger's not going to know if let's say that there's a chemical imbalance in his brain or so. Let's say there's a structural issue in his brain. Let's say that his amygdala is much smaller than the normal person's, right? He's not going to know that. But there's research showing that a smaller amygdala, not always, but oftentimes a smaller amygdala is correlated, not in a causal way, but it's correlated with psychopathy. So the question of why you have to approach from a lot of different angles. And it's never going to be as simplistic as saying that person's evil. It's usually going to be nature, nurture, upbringing, attachment, brain structure, brain chemistry, personality disorders, right? It's usually going to be a huge array of different elements that come together to create that particular crime. If I know 12 possible reasons or whys for a crime, I can probably narrow it down to like 3 or 4 that make the most sense, that have the most explanatory power. But at the end of the day, this idea that there's a why, a single why, is misleading. And criminals don't know the why. Again, like Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a great example of someone who really doesn't know the why. He commits these murders because he thinks he wants to show he can get away with murder, and he has all these different theories about why he's doing it. But at the end, he doesn't really. Not only does he not only does he not understand himself, but he doesn't understand his motives. Motives are never totally transparent to a criminal. Your mic.
I get it. Thank you. Somebody said that you're inspiring them to read classic literature, and I want to say yes, John would be inspired that you're inspired by that, because he believes.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah, I love that, because I believe strongly that there's no profession that has all the answers. So whether that's psychology or sociology or English literature or physics, like any field of study, they're not going to offer the answer. They're just going to give us a version of reality. So I think for me, literature is one of my go-tos, because it really, literature displays the complexity more so than many research studies in psychology. It shows us the complexity of human interactions and relationships and the human psyche, more so than many other areas of study, for me personally.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you to Dr. John. We're going to run. I have a whole other life to do, as many of you know. And I start to cough because I'm thinking about it. As many of you know, we are covering the James Craig case because cameras cannot be in this courtroom, and it is a very important case and trial, and there are no cameras. So we are bringing you the very latest from there as well. So for those that aren't caught up on the James Craig case, we have a full playlist. We'll have that playlist pinned in comments, and very shortly, maybe in the next 20, 30 minutes, we will have a live set to go over all that happened today in court for the James Craig trial as well. We also have more of Dr. John. For those that realize that it's mostly me on YouTube and Dr. John is often not here, and these lives are so wonderful. Dr. John Matthias, a licensed, a clinical and forensic psychologist, is often over on Patreon, patreon.com/hidden true crime. We do most of our episodes with him there at this time for many reasons. Many of you might be able to guess, due to, the desire we have to agree to disagree, and a wonderful discussion over at patreon.com/hidden true crime. So,
and Apple subscriptions.
And Apple, and our Apple subscription as well on our podcast. And we will have this episode shortly on our podcast, Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to your podcasts. So thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate all of you. And thank you. And again, I'll see you guys shortly. We'll see you. Have a good night.
Good night.